I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say. Plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, the body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone. Now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s it was common here to be buried in plastic, to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway we realized it is a curse. A lot of bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reuse site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old, and should be basically gone. But nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for 50-60 years. The smell was awful, the sight was even worse. I'm sure this is not the kind of story you wanted, but it's honestly the most horrific and bizarre thing I've ever been part of. Not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere pretty much and is surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket. And they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative was carrying when the body fell out the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bones but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. Former funeral director here. My partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call for a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to embalming table we heard an audible click in my hometown, of course way before I was ever around. The older of them was said to be sensitive, as in he felt and saw things, and there are stories of people that he buried that came by during nights to tell him that they were cold, which means that there were no flowers/wreaths on the grave, or that their feet were cold. The soil around where the foot of the casket was had leveled. He was also said to be able to see people in what we refer to as Hamfrith, skin journey. As in the body shows itself to tell someone that the soul has departed. One particular story about that they still tell around the Sunday dinner table is when a friend of his had been lost at sea. Nobody knew of course until much later. But my 2xg grandfather saw his friend entering the house, drenched in seawater, and noisily walk into the living room and sits himself on an old sailor's chest that was by the door, and just as soon the man disappears. My great-grandfather took over his father's job when he got too old to do it. I can't remember any similar stories about him, but there is a joke about some youngsters that tried to scare him that people have told all over the country, probably an imported joke. There were a few people in town that didn't like the fact that the graveyard workers worked after dark, and there were a group of young men that decided that enough was enough. They were going to scare the gravedigger. So they outfitted themselves with white sheets and went to the graveyard and walked around the graveyard saying all sorts of ghostly sounds like boo. And they found the gravedigger as he was in the middle of digging a grave by hand, and they stood around the grave for what seemed like hours, shouting and screaming and doing whatever it is that ghosts do. The gravedigger paid them no mind and just continued with his work. The young men then, having given up, started to leave, and as they approached the gate of the graveyard they could hear shouting and protesting behind them, as the gravedigger angrily came running towards them, shouting, "It's one thing that you are up and about walking around here, but don't you think for a second that I will allow you to leave?" My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. Edit. RIP my inbox. Thanks for the silver kind stranger. And just to clarify, I am originally from the Midwest, so weed eating is a relatively normal term used to say you're going to go whack some weeds. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were a husband and wife. It's not clear on what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kind of made it sound like an illness of some kind, and they were all quarantined in the school until they all died. After that the school was demolished and the students and husband and wife were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. Jesus, that's absolutely terrifying. When I was in college I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. It's not quite the same, but I had an uncle who tried working, as in selling and doing drugs, the graveyards between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. He only lasted a few nights in that area then never went back. What was it that scared him so badly that he felt his soul rattle in his bones, as his blood froze cold? Prairie dogs. Fucking prairie dogs. What's so frightening about simple ground squirrels, you might ask? Those cute little fuzzballs that scavenge whatever they can. Well, apparently they like to randomly come out their holes in the middle of the night, and scream. Creepy, but that doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, now imagine being surrounded by dozens of little rodents you can't see, in the pitch black of night, surrounded by the dead, tweaked out of your mind, paranoid as hell, and then suddenly hearing hellish blood-curdling screaming all around you. His little group scattered like roaches, and I think someone fell into a ditch, but he was convinced it was an empty grave. He never did that again. Edit. Wow, Sliver. Thank you so much. I'm honestly just glad so many have enjoyed my uncle's story and that it wasn't completely lost beneath all of the others. D. I used to work as a park ranger in a cemetery in London which has been converted into a nature reserve. It's in a very ghetto area. The local kids nicknamed it the Forest. Regularly we'd find ammunition, knives and occasionally pistols hidden in the memorials/gravestones, and the police would be called to collect them. A friend once found a backpack full of Molotov cocktails prepared. I never saw a pistol myself. Only once I had the honor of finding something. I found a plastic bag stuffed behind a collapsed monument, and inside it had a load of shotgun shells. It was terrifying for me because you have no idea if someone is watching you or aware that you've just found their stash. The police come, you have to show them where it is, and that further highlights your involvement to any of the local kids watching you. That particular park people avoid as soon as the sun goes down. I take care of a small family mausoleum. The family that is buried there has no living descendants, so it falls to me to clean out the facility and replace the flowers inside the building. I also make sure that there's no damage to the mausoleum. I've become very acquainted with the family that is buried inside. One day, as I was closing up my office, my phone rang, and when I answered it there was a very agitated woman on the other end. She was very clearly under the influence of something. She asked me repeatedly if I knew where Jane Smith was. Jane Smith has been buried in the mausoleum since the early 1900s. I asked her why she needed to know. The woman very calmly asked me to go to the mausoleum to double-check that Jane was still there because she believed that she was her. I assured her that I was pretty sure Jane was still peacefully buried, and our phone conversation ended a few moments later. Drugs and alcohol are a hell of a thing, but it still creeped me out enough that I don't answer my phone after 5 p.m. any longer, and I make sure someone is with me when I go to the cemetery.